A Tale of Werewolves, Alphas, and Fated Destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The morning of the mating ceremony dawned cold and gray, which Sarah Moonwhisper thought was fitting, because everything about her life had been cold and gray for as long as she could remember, wrapped in the kind of loneliness that seeps into your bones and makes a home there, refusing to leave no matter how many times you try to convince yourself that you're fine with being alone. She woke before dawn in her tiny attic room in the servants' quarters of the Meadowbrook pack house, her breath fogging in the freezing air, because the heating never quite reached this far up, never quite reached the places where people like her lived. The unwanted ones, the broken ones, the ones who existed on the very edges of pack life like shadows that everyone had learned to look past without really seeing. Her long silver hair spread across the thin pillow like liquid moonlight, and she ran her fingers through it slowly, carefully, savoring the one thing about herself that she secretly, quietly loved, even though Lady Vivian had mocked her for it relentlessly, calling her a copycat for having silver hair, when Vivian herself had dyed her blonde hair silver to match the latest Omega fashion trend, as if Sarah had chosen to be born with hair the color of starlight and winter frost. She hadn't chosen any of this. Not her appearance with its pale, luminous skin that made people whisper about ghosts and bad omens. Not her violet gray eyes that seemed to see too much and made others uncomfortable when she looked at them too directly. Not her small, delicate frame that made her look fragile and breakable, when inside she was anything but, and certainly not the silence that had wrapped around her vocal cords like iron chains when she was 6 years old and watched her parents die in a rogue attack, their screams cutting off abruptly while her own screams stayed locked inside her throat, trapped there forever, turning her into the mute girl that nobody wanted, the Omega who couldn't even fulfill the most basic requirement of her designation, because how could you soothe pack tensions and mediate conflicts when you couldn't speak a single word? Today was her 7th mating ceremony, which meant she had stood in that great hall 7 times now, watching as other Omegas were chosen, claimed, celebrated, while she remained in the shadows trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible, because being invisible was safer than being seen and rejected. Safer than watching the disgust or pity flash across an alpha's face when they realized she was the broken one, the defective Omega who would bring shame to any wolf who claimed her. She was 24 years old, which made her the oldest unclaimed Omega in the pack's history, a fact that Alpha Marcus reminded her of regularly with increasing irritation in his voice, as if her continued single status was a personal insult to his leadership, as if he hadn't benefited from her free labor in the kitchens and gardens for the past 18 years since her parents' death had left her an orphan with nowhere else to go. Sarah pulled herself out of bed and dressed in the plain gray dress that had been provided for her, the color that unmated Omegas wore when they had attended too many ceremonies without success, when they had crossed from eligible into undesirable in the pack's collective consciousness. And she hated that dress with a passion that surprised her, because she had thought she was past feeling anything about these ceremonies, had thought she had successfully numbed herself to the hope and the disappointment and the crushing weight of rejection. But apparently some small, stubborn part of her heart still held on to the foolish dream that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time someone would see past her silence and her strange appearance and recognize that she had worth, that she had value, that she deserved to be chosen just like every other Omega who had stood in that hall and found their mate while she watched from the sidelines of her own life. The knock on her door was soft and familiar, the gentle rap of knuckles against wood that could only belong to one person in this entire pack house. And Sarah opened the door to find Mira standing there, with her weathered face creased in a warm smile. Her elderly hands holding a small bundle of wildflowers that she must have gathered from the winter garden before dawn, before the frost could claim them. Mira was 70 years old and had been the pack's head gardener for 5 decades, and she was the only person in Meadowbrook who had ever bothered to learn sign language properly. The only person who spoke to Sarah like she was a real person, instead of an unfortunate charity case or a useful servant whose silence made her easy to ignore when convenient. "Good morning, little moon," Mira said softly, using the nickname she had given Sarah years ago, and her gnarled fingers moved through the signs as she spoke, because Mira always signed and spoke simultaneously, never making Sarah feel like her communication method was a burden or an inconvenience. "I brought you flowers for your hair, because today feels different, child. The winter wind has been whispering to me all night about changes coming, about destinies shifting, about the moon goddess finally remembering her lost daughter." Sarah's hands moved in the fluid gestures of sign language, the only voice she had left in this world, and she signed back with practiced ease, even though her heart was heavy with resignation rather than hope. "Change never comes for the silent ones, Mira. You know that as well as I do. The world doesn't reshape itself for those who cannot demand attention, who cannot speak up and claim space, who cannot argue their worth with pretty words and persuasive speeches." Mira shook her head firmly and reached up to tuck one of the wildflowers behind Sarah's ear. Her touch gentle and motherly, in a way that made Sarah's chest ache with longing for the parents she had lost, for the life she might have had if that rogue attack had never happened, if her voice hadn't frozen in her throat and never thawed. "The loudest voices are not always the most powerful ones, child, and sometimes the moon goddess speaks in whispers that only the wise can hear. And I think today, someone wise is going to finally hear you, really hear you, in ways that have nothing to do with sound and everything to do with truly seeing who you are beneath the surface." Sarah wanted to believe her, wanted to let that stubborn spark of hope ignite into something bigger. But she had been disappointed too many times, had stood in those shadows too many ceremonies in a row, had watched too many alphas and betas look right through her as if she were made of glass, as if she were already a ghost haunting the edges of their celebration. She signed a simple thank you to Mira, unable to express the depth of her gratitude for this woman who had been more of a mother to her than anyone else in the past 18 years, who had taught her about herbs and healing and how to communicate with the natural world in ways that transcended words, who had shown her that silence could be filled with meaning if you knew how to listen properly. After Mira left, Sarah spent a few precious minutes brushing out her long silver hair, watching it catch the weak morning light filtering through her small window. And she allowed herself this one vanity, this one thing she permitted herself to appreciate about her appearance, even though she knew she should hide it, should braid it up and cover it. Because every time Lady Vivian saw Sarah's natural silver hair, she made cutting remarks about servants trying to ape their betters, about how pathetic it was that Sarah thought having unusual hair color could make up for being a mute freak. But Sarah was tired of hiding, tired of making herself smaller and less visible to accommodate other people's discomfort. And if this was going to be another ceremony where she stood unwanted in the shadows, then at least she would stand there with her silver hair flowing free, with this one piece of herself that she refused to be ashamed of, no matter how many people told her she should be. The packhouse kitchens were already bustling with activity when Sarah arrived for her morning duties, the air thick with the smell of baking bread and roasting meat for the feast that would follow the ceremony, and the other Omegas were chattering excitedly in high-pitched voices that grated on Sarah's nerves because their happiness was so careless so thoughtless, so completely unaware of how lucky they were to be able to speak, to be heard, to participate in conversations without having to wait for someone to notice their signing and deign to translate. They were gossiping about the rumor that had spread through the pack like wildfire over the past week. The whisper that Alpha King Theron Nightshade himself was going to attend today's ceremony, that he was still searching for his Luna after 3 years of ruling alone, that he had attended over 40 mating ceremonies across all the territories in his quest to find the mate that the moon goddess had destined for him. "I heard he's the most handsome alpha in the entire Northern Territories," one Omega said breathlessly, her hands pausing in their task of kneading dough as she indulged in the fantasy. "They say his hair is pure silver, long and beautiful, and his eyes are ice blue like winter itself, and he's so tall and powerful that other alphas bow before him without question. Lady Vivian is convinced he'll choose her," another Omega added with a hint of jealousy in her voice, because everyone knew that Vivian was Alpha Marcus's daughter and therefore had advantages that common Omegas could never dream of possessing. "She's been preparing for weeks, had a new dress made in silver silk to match the color that's fashionable now, been practicing her most charming smiles and her most graceful movements, and Alpha Marcus has been boasting to anyone who will listen that his daughter will be the next Luna Queen of the Northern Territories." Sarah moved through the kitchen like a ghost, collecting ingredients for the healing tea that the head cook had ordered her to prepare, and not a single one of the chattering Omegas acknowledged her presence, even though she was right there among them, even though she was close enough to touch, because they had all learned years ago that Sarah Moon Whisper didn't count, didn't matter, didn't exist in any meaningful way that required their attention or courtesy. The head cook snapped her fingers at Sarah impatiently when the tea wasn't ready fast enough. Her face twisted in irritation that she never bothered to hide, because what was Sarah going to do about it? Complain? File a grievance when she couldn't even say a single word in her own defense? "Useless girl," the cook muttered, loud enough for Sarah to hear, but quiet enough that it could be dismissed as just talking to herself if anyone important overhead. "Can't even follow simple orders without needing everything spelled out in those ridiculous hand gestures. I don't know why Alpha Marcus keeps her around. She's more trouble than she's worth, eats our food, and takes up space without contributing anything valuable." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she poured the hot water over the healing herbs, chamomile and lavender and mint, that would soothe nerves and settle stomachs for the Omegas, who were too excited about the ceremony to eat properly. And she wanted to scream that she contributed more than any of them realized, that she was the one who kept the herb garden thriving through the harsh winters, that she was the one who healed the small injuries and illnesses that the pack healers were too busy to bother with, that she worked twice as hard as anyone else precisely, because she knew her silence made her vulnerable to dismissal. But she couldn't scream, couldn't defend herself, couldn't make them understand. So she just finished preparing the tea with shaking hands and delivered it to the serving table before escaping out the kitchen door into the cold morning air, desperate for space to breathe, for a moment of peace before the ceremony began and she had to face another round of public rejection. The winter garden was Sarah's sanctuary, the one place in the entire pack territory where she felt truly safe, truly seen, truly valued, because plants didn't care that she couldn't speak, and animals didn't judge her for being different, and the natural world communicated in ways that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with energy and intention and understanding that transcended language. She walked among the frost-covered plants, her fingers trailing over leaves and stems, and she felt the familiar pulse of her gift awakening, the empathic healing ability that let her sense the life force in living things. that let her understand their needs and pains and joys in ways that she could never understand the wolves around her, who spoke with their mouths, but lied with their intentions. A small brown sparrow landed on a nearby branch, and Sarah could immediately feel that something was wrong with it, could sense the pain radiating from its left wing where the bone had been fractured, probably from a failed landing or an encounter with a predator. And without thinking, she extended her hand slowly, carefully, waiting for the bird to make the choice to trust her. The sparrow hopped closer, tilted its head to study her with bright, intelligent eyes that saw past her appearance and her silence to the genuine desire to help that lived at her core. And then it fluttered onto her outstretched palm with a tiny weight that felt both fragile and precious. Sarah closed her eyes and let her healing gift flow through her hand into the bird's damaged wing, feeling the bone knit back together under her touch, feeling the pain ease and fade until the sparrow chirped happily and took flight, circling her head twice as if in thanks before disappearing into the gray winter sky. This was what she was meant to do. This was where her value lay. Not in speaking pretty words or playing political games or catching the attention of some alpha who would probably just reject her anyway, but in healing, in helping, in making the world just slightly less painful for the creatures who inhabited it alongside her. You have more worth in your little finger than those chattering girls in the kitchen have in their whole bodies. Mira's voice came from behind her, and Sarah turned to find the elderly gardener watching her with knowing eyes that had witnessed the small miracle of the bird's healing. The moon goddess gave you gifts that matter, child. Gifts that last beyond pretty faces and clever words, and someday someone is going to recognize that and value you the way you deserve to be valued. Sarah wanted to believe that. Truly she did. But belief required hope, and hope was dangerous. Hope was the thing that got crushed ceremony after ceremony when she stood in those shadows and watched everyone else get chosen while she remained alone. And she had learned over the years that it was safer to expect nothing than to hope for something and have that hope shattered into pieces that cut when you tried to gather them back up. She signed to Mira that she needed to go prepare for the ceremony, that she should go to her room and change into that awful gray dress and braid her hair into something more appropriate for a servant Omega who knew her place. But Mira caught her hand before she could leave and held it firmly, her old fingers surprisingly strong. "Don't you dare hide that beautiful hair today," Mira said fiercely, her eyes blazing with an emotion that looked almost like prophecy, like certainty, like she knew something that Sarah didn't. "You wear it down and flowing free. You let it catch the light. You show them all that you are not ashamed of who you are, because today is the day everything changes. I can feel it in my bones, in the earth, in the way the wind whispers secrets that it's been holding for years, waiting for the right moment to release them." And so Sarah found herself a few hours later, standing in the great hall of the Meadowbrook pack house with her silver hair flowing loose down her back, falling almost to her waist in waves that caught the lamplight and seemed to glow with their own inner luminescence. And she had positioned herself in the far back corner where the shadows were deepest, where she could observe without being observed, where she could witness other people's happiness without having her own loneliness thrown into sharp relief by contrast. The hall was decorated beautifully with winter flowers and evergreen boughs, with candles that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, with an atmosphere of celebration and anticipation that made Sarah's chest ache with a longing so deep she couldn't name it, couldn't define it, could only feel it eating away at her from the inside like slow poison. Alpha Marcus stood at the front of the hall, giving his opening speech about the sacred nature of the mating bond, about how the ceremony honored the moon goddess's wisdom in bringing destined pairs together, about how proud he was of his pack's unmated wolves who would hopefully find their perfect matches today. And his words were pretty and practiced. But Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes when he glanced toward his daughter Vivian, could see the ambition lurking beneath the ceremonial platitudes, could see that he cared more about political advantage than genuine connection. Vivian herself was positioned prominently in the center of the Omega gathering, wearing that silver silk dress she had commissioned specifically for this ceremony. Her dyed silver blonde hair artfully arranged to frame her face, her expression practiced into something between sultry and sweet, and Sarah felt a twinge of pity for her despite years of Vivian's cruelty. Because Sarah could see the desperation beneath the beauty, could see the fear that even with all her advantages, she might not be chosen, might not be good enough, might not be the one that the Alpha King wanted. "And now," Alpha Marcus announced, his voice rising with theatrical pride, "it is my great honor to introduce our distinguished guest, Alpha King Theron Nightshade, ruler of the Northern Territories, protector of 50 packs, and the most powerful alpha in our known world." The great doors at the back of the hall swung open with dramatic timing, and Sarah watched from her shadowy corner as the Alpha King entered. And even from a distance, even trying to maintain her protective numbness, she couldn't deny that he was magnificent in a way that made her breath catch in her throat and her heart stutter in her chest, with something that felt dangerous like hope, trying to resurrect itself from the grave where she had buried it. Theron Nightshade was everything the rumors had promised, and more, standing at least 6 feet 4 inches tall with a presence that seemed to fill the entire hall, despite the fact that he had only just entered. His broad shoulders draped in formal regalia that marked him as royalty, but couldn't disguise the raw power that radiated from him like heat from a forge. The kind of power that made other alphas instinctively lower their eyes in submission even as they tried to maintain their dignity. His silver hair fell past his shoulders in a straight curtain that caught the candlelight and seemed to shimmer with its own internal starlight, and Sarah found herself transfixed by the sight of it, because she had never seen anyone else with true silver hair like hers, had always been told that her coloring was unnatural and wrong, and a sign of some fundamental defect in her bloodline. But here was the most powerful alpha in the known world, wearing the same silver crown that she had been mocked for her entire life, and something about that made her chest feel tight with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. His face was striking rather than conventionally handsome, all sharp angles and strong lines that suggested strength and intelligence in equal measure, and his eyes were the most remarkable shade of ice blue that Sarah had ever seen, pale and piercing and intense in a way that made her think of winter storms and frozen lakes, and things that were both beautiful and dangerous simultaneously. He moved through the hall with the fluid grace of a born predator, his 12 elite guards flanking him in perfect formation, and Sarah noticed that all 12 of them had silver-white fur in their wolf forms, based on the glimpses of it she could see beneath their formal uniforms. And she wondered what it meant that the Alpha King surrounded himself with wolves who shared his unusual coloring, wondered if perhaps he understood what it was like to be different, to be marked as other, to carry visible proof that you didn't fit into the neat categories that society preferred. The assembled Omegas preened and postured as Theron passed them, each one trying to catch his attention with carefully practiced smiles and strategic positioning that was supposed to look casual, but was actually calculated down to the precise angle of their heads and the exact amount of cleavage showing in their ceremony dresses. And Sarah watched this display with a mixture of pity and exhaustion, because she had seen it so many times before, had watched Omegas transform themselves into whatever they thought an alpha wanted, instead of simply being themselves and trusting that the right person would value their authentic self. Lady Vivian was the worst of them all, practically throwing herself into Theron's path with a curtsy so low it was almost comical. Her dyed silver blonde hair swishing dramatically as she rose and offered him her most dazzling smile, the one she had practiced in mirrors for hours until she achieved exactly the right balance of innocent and inviting. "Your Majesty," Vivian purred in a voice dripping with honey and ambition, her hand extended as if she expected him to kiss it like they did in the old romantic stories. "What an incredible honor it is to have you grace our humble pack with your presence. I am Lady Vivian Stoneheart, daughter of Alpha Marcus, and I would be delighted to show you around our territory after the ceremony. If you find yourself in need of a knowledgeable guide who can point out all the most interesting features of our land." Theron's ice-blue eyes swept over Vivian with the kind of polite disinterest that Sarah recognized immediately, because she had seen that exact expression on dozens of alpha faces over the years, that look that said the person in front of them was being assessed and found wanting, not because they were necessarily bad or wrong, but simply because they weren't the right fit, weren't the one that some deep instinctual part of the alpha's soul was searching for. He inclined his head with perfect courtesy, his voice when he spoke carrying the kind of authority that made it clear he was accustomed to being obeyed without question, and he said something polite but non-committal about appreciating the pack's hospitality before moving past Vivian without taking her offered hand, leaving her standing there with her smile frozen on her face and her hand still extended in a gesture that had become suddenly pathetic rather than alluring. Sarah felt that inappropriate surge of satisfaction watching Vivian's humiliation, even though she knew it made her petty and small to take pleasure in another person's rejection. But after years of Vivian's cruelty, after countless incidents of her mocking Sarah's silence and her appearance and her lowly status, there was something deeply gratifying about watching the golden girl of Meadowbrook Pack get dismissed by the one alpha, whose attention she had been so certain she could capture. The ceremony proceeded with its traditional format, with Alpha Marcus explaining the protocol for those unfamiliar with how mating ceremonies worked in their pack, how alphas and betas would approach the omegas they were interested in and formally offer their claim, how the omegas could accept or decline based on their own feelings and instincts, how the moon goddess guided these choices even when the participants thought they were making decisions based purely on logic or attraction or practical considerations. Several pairings were made in the first hour, joyful matches between wolves who had been circling each other for months but needed the formal ceremony to finally make their intentions clear. And Sarah watched each successful pairing with the same bittersweet mixture of happiness for them and sorrow for herself that she experienced at every ceremony, genuinely glad that other people were finding their mates and building their futures while simultaneously being crushed under the weight of her own isolation and the growing certainty that she would never have what they had, would never experience that moment of being chosen, of being wanted, of being seen as valuable enough to claim in front of witnesses. She noticed that Theron was watching the proceedings with careful attention, his ice-blue eyes tracking each interaction, each pairing, each acceptance and rejection. And there was something in his expression that suggested he was looking for something specific, searching for some sign or signal that would tell him he had found what he had been seeking through 40 previous ceremonies. The afternoon shadows were lengthening across the hall's stone floor when Corin approached Sarah in her corner, and she felt her entire body tense with dread because she knew Corin, knew his cruelty, knew the particular brand of malicious amusement he took in tormenting those weaker than himself, and she could smell the alcohol on his breath from 3 feet away, which meant he had been drinking despite the ceremony's formal nature. And drunk Corin was even worse than sober Corin when it came to casual cruelty disguised as humor. He was a beta warrior, tall and reasonably attractive in a rough way that some Omegas found appealing, but his eyes held a meanness that no amount of physical beauty could disguise, and Sarah had been the target of his mockery more times than she could count, enduring his crude jokes about her silence and his speculation about whether she could make any sounds at all during intimate moments, comments that made her skin crawl and her stomach turn, but that she couldn't defend herself against, because what was she going to do? Sign angry responses that he would just ignore or mock. Well, well, if it isn't the little ghost girl hiding in her corner like always, Corin said loudly enough that nearby wolves turned to look, his words slurring slightly as he swayed on his feet. 7 ceremonies now, isn't it? 7 times standing here unwanted while everyone else gets claimed. Must be some kind of record for how undesirable one Omega can be. But I'm feeling generous today, feeling charitable, and I figure someone should take pity on you before you die alone and unmated like the pathetic creature you are. Sarah's hands moved quickly in sign language, her fingers forming the symbols for, "No thank you, I decline," with as much dignity as she could muster, while her heart was pounding with humiliation and her face was burning with shame. But Corin either didn't understand her signs or deliberately chose to ignore them, because he kept talking as if she hadn't responded at all, as if her method of communication didn't count as real communication, as if her clear refusal was somehow less valid than if she had spoken it aloud. Several pack members had gathered to watch this interaction with the kind of morbid curiosity that people always seem to have for public humiliation, their faces showing mixtures of pity and amusement and uncomfortable fascination. And Sarah wanted to disappear, wanted to melt into the shadows and cease to exist, wanted to be anywhere except standing in this hall, being treated like a joke in front of the entire pack, plus the most powerful alpha in the territories. "Come on now, don't be difficult," Corin continued, reaching out to grab Sarah's arm with fingers that dug in hard enough to bruise, his grip possessive and controlling in a way that made her wolf surge forward with the instinct to fight, to protect, to refuse this violation of her boundaries. "No one else is going to offer to mate a broken mute Omega who can't even speak. I'm doing you a favor here. The least you could do is show some gratitude instead of making those ridiculous hand gestures like they mean anything. Just nod your head and accept that this is the best you're ever going to get." Alpha Marcus had noticed the commotion and made his way over, with an expression that suggested he was viewing this as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be protected. And when he spoke, his voice carried that particular tone of strained patience that he always used when dealing with Sarah, as if her very existence was an inconvenience that he tolerated only because pack law required him to provide for orphaned wolves even when those orphans were defective in some fundamental way. "Sarah, Corin is making you a generous offer considering your circumstances. You're 24 years old now, well past the age when most Omegas are mated, and I think we both know that your options are extremely limited given your inability to speak and your generally off-putting appearance. So perhaps you should seriously consider accepting this proposal rather than being difficult about it like you're in some position to be choosy." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each one landing with precision in the places where she was already wounded, already broken, already convinced of her own worthlessness. And she felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall, because crying would just prove what everyone already thought about her, that she was weak and pathetic and incapable of handling the reality of her situation with anything resembling strength or dignity. Her hands moved frantically in sign language, trying to explain that she was refusing the offer, that she didn't want Corin as a mate, that she would rather remain alone than be claimed by someone who viewed her as a charity case or a joke. But no one was paying attention to her signs except for Mira, who had appeared at the edge of the crowd with distress written across her weathered face, too far away to intervene, but close enough to witness Sarah's humiliation in all its ugly detail. Corin's grip on Sarah's arm tightened painfully as he pulled her closer, his alcohol-soaked breath washing over her face in a wave that made her stomach heave, and he was saying something about how she should be grateful that any wolf was willing to overlook her defects, how she should stop pretending she had standards when everyone knew she was the bottom of the barrel, how he might as well take her off the pack's hands since she was eating their resources and contributing nothing of value in return. The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the spectacle of public rejection and humiliation, the way crowds always seemed to gather around car accidents and public arguments. And Sarah could see Lady Vivian in the group with a smirk on her perfect face, clearly enjoying watching the weird mute servant girl get put in her place, clearly savoring this moment of schadenfreude that confirmed her own superiority in the pack hierarchy. And then everything changed, with a sound that cut through the noise of the crowd and the buzzing in Sarah's ears and the pounding of her heart, a sound that was low and dangerous and absolutely unmistakable in its meaning, a growl that came from somewhere deep in a powerful chest and carried with it the promise of violence if the warning wasn't immediately heeded. Every wolf in the vicinity froze instantly, their instincts recognizing the authority in that sound, recognizing the dominance, recognizing that someone much more powerful than anyone else in the room had just issued a command that would be obeyed, or there would be consequences of the most serious kind. Sarah's head snapped up to find the source of the growl, and her violet-gray eyes locked with ice-blue ones across the distance that separated them. And she watched in stunned disbelief as Alpha King Theron Nightshade moved through the crowd toward her with deadly purpose in every line of his body, his silver hair swinging with each powerful stride, his guards following close behind him in formation that suggested they were prepared for combat if necessary. The crowd parted before him like water before a ship's prow, wolves pressing themselves against walls and furniture to get out of his path. And Sarah felt Corin's grip on her arm loosen and then release entirely as the beta warrior stumbled backward with fear written across his face, suddenly very aware that he had done something to attract the Alpha King's attention, and that said attention was decidedly negative in nature. Theron stopped a few feet from Sarah, close enough that she could see the rage burning in his ice-blue eyes, but controlled enough that she understood he wasn't angry at her, wasn't threatening her, was in fact directing all that fury at Corin and anyone else who had participated in or witnessed her humiliation without intervening. His voice when he spoke was quiet, but carried throughout the hall anyway, because every single wolf present was holding their breath and straining to hear what the Alpha King would say, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was keeping himself on a very tight leash, maintaining control over instincts that wanted him to shift and tear apart anyone who had hurt this Omega, who he had somehow identified as important, despite the fact that he had never spoken to her before this moment. "Remove your hand from her," Theron said, and even though Corin had already released Sarah's arm, the command hung in the air like a threat, like a promise that any further touching would result in consequences that the beta warrior definitely didn't want to experience. "Now, step back and explain to me why you thought it was acceptable to grab an Omega who was clearly refusing your advance. Why you thought it was appropriate to mock and humiliate someone who has no voice to defend herself. Why you thought I would stand here and watch this display of cruelty without intervening." Corin stammered something incoherent, his face pale with fear, and Alpha Marcus tried to smooth things over, with political platitudes about misunderstandings and high spirits and ceremonies sometimes getting a bit rowdy. But Theron's cold stare silenced him mid-sentence, and when the Alpha King turned his attention back to Sarah, she felt her breath catch in her throat, because the way he was looking at her was nothing like the way anyone had ever looked at her before. Nothing like the dismissal or pity or disgust she was accustomed to seeing in people's eyes when they bothered to look at her at all. He was looking at her like she was precious, like she was important, like she was something rare and valuable that needed to be protected. And Sarah didn't know how to process that kind of attention, because it contradicted everything she had learned about her own worth over the past 18 years. Theron approached her slowly, carefully, his movements deliberate and non-threatening in a way that suggested he understood she had just been traumatized and needed to be handled with gentleness rather than dominance. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge of rage and become something softer, something that made Sarah's chest ache with an emotion she couldn't name. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his ice-blue eyes scanning her body for injuries, lingering on her arm where Corin's fingers had left red marks that were already starting to darken into bruises. "Did he harm you in any way that requires immediate healing attention?" Sarah shook her head slowly, her silver hair falling forward to partially hide her face, because she didn't know how to handle this much focused attention from someone so important. Didn't know how to reconcile the fact that the Alpha King was standing here in front of her, asking if she was okay when no one had ever cared about her well-being before, except for Mira. Her hands moved hesitantly in sign language, forming the symbols for, "I am fine, thank you for intervening," with fingers that trembled slightly from residual adrenaline and shock, and she watched Theron's face carefully to see if he would dismiss her signs the way Corin had, if he would demand that she communicate properly, if he would reveal that his concern was performative rather than genuine. But Theron's eyes tracked her hand movements with complete attention, his brow furrowing slightly as he tried to understand what she was saying, and when he clearly couldn't decipher her meaning, he turned to his guards and asked if any of them knew sign language, his tone suggesting that he considered her method of communication perfectly valid, and was frustrated with his own inability to understand it, rather than frustrated with her for using it. One of the 12 guards stepped forward, an older woman with kind eyes and silver-white hair pulled back in a severe bun, and she said in a clear voice that carried authority despite being female in a guard position that was typically male-dominated. "I know the language, Your Majesty. I can translate for the young Omega, if she consents to having her words shared publicly." Sarah nodded her permission, grateful beyond words that someone was willing to bridge the communication gap without making her feel like a burden. And the guardwoman watched carefully as Sarah signed again, this time with more detail, her fingers forming the words. "I am unharmed. Thank you for protecting me when no one else would. I declined his offer to mate, but he would not accept my refusal. I am grateful for your intervention, even though I do not understand why the Alpha King would concern himself with a lowly servant Omega." The guard translated Sarah's signs word for word, her voice neutral, but her eyes sympathetic. And Sarah watched Theron's face as he listened to her words, watched something flicker through his expression that looked almost like pain mixed with recognition, mixed with something deeper that she didn't have a name for. When the translation was complete, Theron was quiet for a long moment, his ice-blue eyes never leaving Sarah's face, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but also made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before. Seen not as a problem to be solved or a defect to be managed, but as a person with inherent value regardless of her inability to speak. "What is your name?" Theron asked finally, And the simple question hit Sarah like a thunderbolt, because in all the years she had lived in Meadowbrook Pack, in all the ceremonies she had attended, in all the interactions she had endured, no alpha had ever bothered to ask her name. No one had ever considered her important enough to warrant that basic courtesy. Her hands moved to spell out her name in the sign language alphabet, and the guard translated, "Sarah Moonwhisper." And Theron repeated the name softly, as if tasting it, testing how it felt in his mouth, and then he smiled slightly and said, "That is a beautiful name for a beautiful Omega." The hall erupted in whispers and gasps because the Alpha King had just called the weird mute servant girl beautiful, had just validated her in front of the entire pack in a way that couldn't be undone or ignored, and Sarah felt her entire world tilting on its axis. Because this couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of elaborate joke or test or mistake that would be revealed any moment now when Theron realized what he had said and who he had said it to. But he wasn't looking around the hall at the other Omegas, wasn't reassessing his statement, wasn't backing away from her in embarrassment at having made such an obvious error in judgment. Instead, he was moving closer, was kneeling before her in a gesture that made every wolf in the hall gasp, because Alpha Kings did not kneel before anyone, especially not before broken servant Omegas who couldn't speak. "Sarah Moonwhisper," Theron said, and his voice was formal now, carrying the weight of ceremony and intention, carrying the sound of something important being said that would change everything that came after it. "I need to know before I continue. Has anyone here claimed you as their mate? Are you bound to another wolf by promise or obligation? Are you free to make your own choice about who you accept as a partner?" Sarah's hands moved to sign her response, and the guard translated in a voice that had gone slightly breathless with shock at what was clearly about to happen. "No one has ever wanted me. I am unclaimed and free. I have been rejected at every ceremony for 6 years because I cannot speak, and most wolves find me unsettling to look at. I am not bound to anyone." And then Theron did something that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. Something that would become the dividing line between her old existence and her new one. Something that would prove that the moon goddess had not forgotten her after all, but had simply been waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right alignment of fate and choice and destiny. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and he took both of her hands in his much larger ones, his touch gentle despite the obvious strength in his fingers, and he looked directly into her violet gray eyes and said words that shattered her entire understanding of her own worth and rebuilt it into something new and precious and impossibly hopeful. "Then I would like to change that," Theron said clearly, his words ringing through the hall like a bell. "Sarah Moonwhisper, I have been searching for you for 3 years. My mother prophesied your existence before she died. She told me I would find my Luna marked by silence and silver, hidden in plain sight at a place of rejection. And here you are, exactly as she described, exactly as I knew you would be when I finally found you. And I am asking you now in front of all these witnesses, will you accept my claim? Will you be my mate? Will you come with me and be the Luna Queen of the Northern Territories?" The world seemed to stop spinning on its axis for a moment that stretched into eternity, and Sarah stood frozen in the center of the great hall, with her hands clasped in Theron's gentle grip, while her mind tried desperately to process what had just happened, what he had just asked, what it would mean if she said yes to this impossible offer that contradicted everything she had ever believed about her own worth and her place in the world. Every eye in the hall was fixed on her with expressions ranging from shock to outrage to disbelief, and she could see Lady Vivian's face twisted in fury at the back of the crowd, could see Alpha Marcus's calculation as he tried to figure out how to turn this situation to his political advantage, could see Mira's tears of joy streaming down her weathered cheeks as the old gardener watched her prophetic words come true in real time. But none of those reactions mattered nearly as much as the expression on Theron's face as he knelt before her and waited for her answer with a patience that suggested he would stay there on his knees for hours if necessary, would wait as long as it took for her to make a decision that felt right to her, rather than rushing her into something she wasn't ready for. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled them free from Theron's grip, and she saw a flash of hurt cross his ice-blue eyes before he carefully masked it, clearly thinking she was about to reject him, about to tell him that even the Alpha King's interest wasn't enough to make her believe she deserved to be chosen. But instead, her fingers moved through the signs that formed a question. The most important question she had ever asked anyone in her entire life. Her hands shaped the words, "Why me?" with a desperation that came from 18 years of being told she was worthless, from 6 years of standing unwanted at ceremonies while everyone else found their mates, from a lifetime of believing that her silence made her fundamentally broken and unlovable. And she needed to understand what Theron saw when he looked at her, because she couldn't see it herself, no matter how hard she tried. The guard translated Sarah's question, and Theron's expression softened into something that looked almost like pain mixed with understanding, mixed with a fierce protectiveness that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. "Why you?" Theron repeated, rising to his feet but maintaining that careful distance that gave her space to breathe, to think, to process without feeling crowded or pressured. "Because when I arrived at your territory hours before the ceremony began, I walked through your lands trying to sense if my mate was here, like my instincts were screaming at me she was, and I found you in the garden surrounded by animals who trusted you completely. Watched you heal a bird with a broken wing, using a gift that I could feel radiating from you like warmth from the sun. Saw the gentleness in your touch and the compassion in your face as you cared for a creature that most wolves would have ignored or dismissed as insignificant." He took a breath, his silver hair catching the lamplight and making him look like something out of ancient legends, like the kind of alpha that ballads were written about centuries after their deaths. "Because I then followed you into the kitchens and watched how the other Omegas treated you, how they looked right through you as if you were invisible, how they mocked you behind your back and dismissed your contributions. And I saw how you handled that cruelty with dignity and grace, how you didn't lash out or become bitter, even though you had every right to both of those reactions, how you simply continued doing your work with quiet competence while they chattered mindlessly about things that didn't matter." Theron's voice grew stronger, more passionate, as if he needed Sarah to understand that his interest in her wasn't based on whim or pity, but on genuine recognition of her value. "Because when I watched you at this ceremony, I saw how you made yourself small and invisible in that corner, how you tried to take up as little space as possible because you had been taught that your presence was unwanted and your existence was a burden. And my heart broke for you because I know what it's like to be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone, to have power and authority and respect, but lack the one thing that actually matters, which is genuine connection with someone who sees you as you really are, rather than as what you represent." He moved closer now, close enough that Sarah could smell winter pine and something wilder, something that made her wolf stir with interest despite her human mind's confusion and fear. "Because my mother told me before she died that my Luna would be marked by silence and silver, that she would be hidden in plain sight at a place of rejection, that everyone else would look at her and see brokenness, but I would see strength. And when I saw you standing in these shadows with your silver hair glowing in the lamplight and your violet-gray eyes watching everything with such careful observation, when I saw how you communicated through your hands with language that others chose not to learn because they considered your method of speaking less valid than their own, I knew with absolute certainty that you were the one my mother prophesied, the one I have been searching for through 40 ceremonies across 3 years, the one who would complete me in ways I didn't even know I was incomplete. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face now, hot and unstoppable, because no one had ever spoken about her like this. No one had ever looked beneath the surface of her silence and her strange appearance to see the person she actually was. No one had ever suggested that her differences might be strengths rather than defects that needed to be overlooked or tolerated. Her hands moved again, signing a confession that she had never shared with anyone except Mira, a fear that lived at the very core of her being and shaped every interaction she had with other wolves. "I am terrified," she signed, and the guard translated with gentle sympathy in her voice. "I am terrified that this is a mistake, that you will realize I am not what you think I am, that I will fail at being a Luna because I cannot give speeches or command respect or do any of the things that leaders are supposed to do. I am terrified of being chosen and then rejected when you discover that I am truly as broken as everyone has always told me I am." Theron's ice-blue eyes blazed with an intensity that made Sarah's knees weak, and he closed the remaining distance between them until they were standing so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could sense the barely controlled power that lived beneath his careful courtesy. "You are not broken," he said fiercely, his voice rough with emotion that he wasn't trying to hide or control. "You are unique. You are rare. You are exactly what a Luna should be, even though you look nothing like what society expects. And let me tell you what I see when I look at you, Sarah Moonwhisper. Let me tell you what everyone else is too blind or too stupid to recognize." His hand reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't move, he gently brushed a strand of silver hair away from her face with fingers that trembled slightly despite his obvious strength. "I see wisdom in your silence, because you have learned to listen in ways that wolves, who never stop talking, cannot comprehend. You have learned to observe and understand people by watching what they do rather than believing what they say. You have developed empathy and insight that come from years of being invisible, which taught you to see others clearly, because you weren't distracted by your own need to be seen." He continued, his words flowing like poetry, like prophecy, like truth that had been waiting centuries to be spoken aloud. "I see strength in your compassion, because remaining kind after years of cruelty requires more courage than most warriors will ever possess. Choosing to heal when you could have become bitter and choosing to help when you could have walked away shows a strength of character that cannot be taught or faked or manufactured through training and discipline." Theron's other hand came up to frame her face, his touch reverent, his expression open and vulnerable in a way that Alpha Kings were not supposed to be in public. "I see power in your gift, because you can heal with a touch and communicate with nature and sense emotions that others try to hide. And those abilities will make you the greatest Luna our territories have ever known, because you will understand your people's needs before they can articulate them. You will solve conflicts by addressing root causes rather than surface symptoms. You will build bridges between packs through genuine understanding rather than political manipulation." The hall had gone completely silent, every wolf present holding their breath and witnessing this declaration that was rewriting everything they thought they knew about value and worth and what made someone deserving of respect. Sarah's hands moved to sign one more question, the last barrier between her old life and the terrifying possibility of a new one. And her fingers formed words that came from the deepest part of her wounded heart. What if I cannot be what you need? What if my silence makes me inadequate as a partner and a leader? What if you grow to resent me for all the things I cannot do? The guard translated, and Theron smiled with such warmth and certainty that it transformed his face from striking to beautiful, and he leaned down until his forehead touched Sarah's, until they were breathing the same air, until the mate bond that had been hovering between them since the moment their eyes first met suddenly snapped into place with a force that made them both gasp. The sensation was overwhelming, like being struck by lightning and drowning in warm honey simultaneously. Like every emotion Theron felt was suddenly accessible to Sarah, and every emotion she felt was flooding into him. And through that bond, she could feel his absolute conviction that she was perfect for him. His complete lack of doubt about her worth. His fierce protective love that had been growing since he watched her in the garden that morning. I don't need you to be anything other than exactly who you are, Theron said softly. His words meant only for her, even though everyone could hear them. I don't need speeches or commands or any of the traditional trappings of leadership. I need a partner who sees what I miss, who heals what I cannot reach, who understands that true strength comes from compassion rather than domination. And you are all of those things and more. You are everything I have been searching for, and everything I didn't know I needed. And I am asking you one more time, Sarah Moonwhisper. Will you choose me? Will you accept my claim? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving to you that you are worthy of being chosen, of being loved, of being valued exactly as you are? Sarah's hands moved without conscious thought, signing the word yes over and over again, while tears continued streaming down her face, and the mate bond pulsed between them with waves of emotion, so intense she thought she might shatter from the force of them. Theron pulled her into his arms, and she felt his whole body shaking with relief and joy as he held her close, his face buried in her silver hair. And when he finally pulled back enough to look at her again, his ice-blue eyes were wet with tears that he made no attempt to hide from the assembled witnesses. Thank you, he breathed, and then he kissed her for the first time, his lips gentle and reverent against hers, and the mate bond flared so brightly between them that several wolves in the hall gasped and stepped back because they could actually see the silver light emanating from where Sarah and Theron touched, could see her empathic healing gift manifesting in response to the completion of the bond, could see physical proof that the moon goddess had blessed this union between the silent Omega and the silver Alpha who had searched 3 years to find her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and glowing with the mate bond's energy, Theron turned to address the hall with authority that brooked no argument. Sarah Moonwhisper is now under my protection as my chosen mate and future Luna Queen of the Northern Territories. She will be leaving with me tonight, and I expect that in the future all packs under my rule will ensure that Omegas who communicate through sign language are given the same respect and accommodation as those who speak verbally, because communication is about conveying meaning and understanding rather than about the specific method used, and anyone who discriminates against wolves for having different abilities will answer to me personally. Alpha Marcus tried to protest about propriety and proper waiting periods and the need for formal ceremonies, but Theron's cold stare silenced him before he could finish his objections. And the Alpha King made it abundantly clear that Sarah's pack had failed her in every possible way, and therefore had no right to dictate terms about her future. Within an hour, Sarah found herself in a luxurious carriage, heading toward the Northern Crown territory, with Elder Sage sitting across from her and explaining the prophecy that Theron's mother had given before her death. Explaining how the former Luna Queen had been a seer who had known that her son would find his mate marked by silence and silver. Explaining that Sarah was exactly what the prophecy had described, down to the smallest detail. The journey took 3 days, and each evening, Theron would join Sarah in the carriage after running with his guards in wolf form, and he would sit respectfully across from her and ask her to teach him sign language, practicing the symbols with endearing clumsiness, until she found herself laughing silently at his mistakes, found herself relaxing in his presence, found herself beginning to believe that maybe this was real. Maybe she truly had been chosen. Maybe the moon goddess had not forgotten her after all, but had simply been preparing her for something greater than she could have imagined during those lonely years of rejection. When they arrived at the Northern Crown Palace, Sarah was overwhelmed by the grandeur of it, by the hundreds of pack members who came out to meet their Alpha King and his new Luna, by the beauty of the winter gardens that Theron immediately took her to, because he understood that she would need a safe space to retreat to when the palace became too overwhelming. Over the following weeks, Sarah adjusted to her new life with a mixture of wonder and terror, learning the territory, meeting key pack members, attending council meetings where Theron made it clear that her observations and insights were valued even though she communicated them through Elder Sage's translation, and slowly, painfully, beginning to accept that she truly belonged here, that she was wanted, that her silence was not a barrier to being loved, but simply a different way of being that Theron and his pack were willing to accommodate and even celebrate. The mate bond grew stronger between them with each passing day, and Sarah discovered that through their connection, she could send Theron emotions and images directly without needing words or signs, could communicate her feelings through the bond in ways that were even more intimate than speech. And he learned to read her expressions and her body language with such accuracy that he could anticipate her needs before she signed them. 6 months after that fateful ceremony at Meadowbrook, they held their official mating ceremony under the full moon with representatives from all 50 packs in attendance. And when Theron marked her neck in front of thousands of witnesses, claiming her as his Luna Queen before the moon goddess and all assembled wolves, Sarah's empathic healing gift exploded outward in a wave of silver light that healed old wounds and soothed old pains for every wolf present, and they knew beyond any doubt that she had been blessed by the moon goddess, that she was exactly what their kingdom needed, that her silence was not weakness, but profound strength. Years passed, and Sarah became legendary throughout the territories as the silent Luna who revolutionized what it meant to lead, who proved that power came from understanding rather than commanding, who built a kingdom where the rejected and the different were valued rather than dismissed. And when young Omegas would come to her feeling broken or unworthy or convinced that their differences made them unlovable, she would take their hands and sign to them through translators about the mating ceremony, where she stood unwanted in the shadows until an Alpha King knelt before her and asked her to be his queen. And she would tell them that the right person doesn't see your differences as defects to be overlooked, but as gifts to be celebrated. That being chosen isn't about being perfect, but about being genuine, that the moon goddess writes different stories for different souls. And just because your story doesn't look like everyone else's, doesn't mean it's wrong. And in the quiet moments when Sarah and Theron sat together in their private chambers, with his hand clasped in hers, and their bond humming with contentment between them, she would sometimes think back to that terrified girl standing in the shadows of the Meadowbrook Great Hall, convinced she would die alone and unwanted, and she would marvel at how completely her life had transformed. because one person had been willing to learn her language, to see past her silence, to recognize that she was not broken, but simply different, that she was not less than but exactly enough, that she had always been worthy of being chosen, even when no one else could see it. The moon goddess had not forgotten the silent Omega after all. She had simply been waiting for the silver Alpha, who would value silence as much as sound, who would understand that the most profound truths are often spoken without words, who would prove that love transcends language and that being seen, truly seen, is the greatest gift one person can give another. If you enjoyed Sarah and Theron's story about finding love and acceptance in the most unexpected places, about proving that being different is a strength rather than a weakness, about the power of being truly seen by someone who values you exactly as you are, then please subscribe to this channel for more werewolf romance tales featuring Alpha Kings, rejected Omegas, and fated mates who defy expectations and rewrite the rules about what makes someone worthy of love. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload when I post new stories about powerful alphas who choose compassion over domination, about Omegas who discover their true strength, and about mate bonds that prove the moon goddess writes different stories for different souls. Leave a comment below telling me what you thought of this story, whether Sarah's journey resonated with you, what your favorite moment was, and what kind of werewolf romance you would like to see next, because your engagement and support means everything to me and directly influences what stories I create, and I love hearing from you about which characters and themes speak to your heart. Thank you so much for reading, for being part of this community, for celebrating stories where the rejected become chosen and the invisible become seen, and I will see you in the next tale of werewolves, alphas, and the fated destinies that bind them together across time and space, and every obstacle that tries to keep true mates apart.